something you emphasize in the book
Mm-hmm.
is that, the sort of framework of Black Lives Matter, that rhetoric, certainly that hashtag, activism that was sort of filtered through there, all of that, all that didn't start in 2020. I mean, 2020 was when it came back, and it came back in a much bigger way than it had been before. But that had all been building for several years, right? Like, you mentioned Trayvon Martin, which was, I want to say, like 2013.
Mm-hmm.
That was at least when the trial was happening. And so you were, you were saying, you were involved in, you were involved in protests, and, in Chicago, you were thinking about this, kind of from that background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so I think there's a couple of things to try to parse out, right? So one, anti-policing activism has been going on for a long time, right? We could go back to the 1960s. We could talk about the Reagan-Bush period, where there's like a spate of protests across the country in response to police killings of Eleanor Bumpurs in New York City, Malice Green in Detroit, all sorts of individualized situations. Even, in the late 90s, the shooting of Amadou Diallo, which I remember attending a protest on the steps of the Capitol with my son, who's actually 25 now, right? Being there at a protest with him when he was a kid. So I think we've been seeing these protests for a long time. The issue I think we should try to think clearly about is, how is Black Lives Matter different? All right, there's this longer history of protests, which involves all sorts of different figures: socialists, liberals, civil rights attorneys, all sorts of different characters. And the protests that we're seeing in the era of hashtags and social media. And so I think this is something different. And the problem that I'm raising in the book is that it actually doesn't really provide us with the kind of analysis of the society overall, and is driven primarily by a sensational mode of organizing around viral videos and the use of social media, right? So it kind of leads in a much more liberal direction than what we need.
Yeah, so I do want to get into that and follow that last thread. But the way that a lot of this stuff gets driven by viral videos is also interesting. I mean, like, and the fact that, I mean, Black Lives Matter, I mean, that's originally a hashtag, right? That's because that's just a very different way of protest energy kind of getting going than what you would have if, in a different historical era, where there are sort of organizations kind of making decisions about which cases to highlight, as opposed to people just, like things happening to catch fire on social media, and everybody responding to them, which is sometimes a, double-edged sword. Because, I mean, the good thing about it is that it means that things that might have flown under the radar, don't, but it also means that, like, sometimes there's a danger that, if things had been vetted, people would react to them differently, because this is just, it's not that, like, somebody looked at this as like, okay, this is going to be a promising one to go after. It's just like, this is what happened to blow up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so let me say a couple of things about social media, good and bad, right? And then try to answer the question. I think it's been great as far as like creativity, right? You think about the sheer cavalcade of comedy, right? All sorts of creative expression, artwork, music, dance, other things that are then shown through various social media platforms, and not even professional influencers and that sort of thing, but just individual moments that families and other people are capturing, that they're sharing, that circulate widely. That's actually exciting in a way. I mean, as much as I'm down on social media and the ways people think about it politically, I think the ways in which we're now able to not just entertain ourselves, but then connect with other people is actually a good thing. The problem with it politically, right, and especially as it relates to police killings, they're only showing certain images, right, and certain killings, right? So many police killings are not videotaped, are not video recorded. So while having cell phones in everybody's hands
Mhm.
opens up this opportunity for us to all be monitors of police if necessary, right? That's a great thing. We're being highly selective about which cases we share, which cases become those worth mobilizing around, and there's been a few incidents where you've seen people who've actually been armed. It's been really clear that they've been armed,
Mhm.
and the police action may have very well been justified. Those don't become
Mhm.
moments for Black Lives Matter mobilization. The other thing too is it because of the ways it circulates, where like once you've watched one of these videos, or once it's clear from the vantage point of the algorithm that you are interested in looking at certain kinds of media or stories, you're going to be fed more of those, right? So it actually alters our consciousness about what's happening. So you're only seeing the most damaging and violent images of, people fighting, inside of a fucking McDonald's or something like that, right? All sorts of sensational imagery, which is different even from the old-fashioned curated, network media, which had its own problems, right? But this is something I think is maybe a bit more pernicious in some ways. And a big problem is that it blinds us to the class dimension of all of this, right? That's the biggest problem that I try to point out in the book, in the sense that if I'm watching day after day images of Black people being assaulted, I don't really know who these Black people are, right? All I know is that they're Black, right? And it becomes almost a self-evident thing that the reason they're being assaulted is because of race and racism. And when we unpack it a bit more and actually spend some time thinking about their lives, the lives of the people who are being heavily policed, for me, and I think for anybody who wants to spend the time looking at it, a very different reality opens up. And it's not just a question of Black people being assaulted by police. It's which Black people are really bearing the brunt of this expanded carceral apparatus. I think I know at one point in the book, I know I've talked about it in a few other places. One of the things that we get from people in the midst of a violent act by police, sort of a fatal killing, on the one side, you'll see the fraternal order and other pro-police forces who'll try to impugn the victim. That's almost always, right?
He was no angel, all that stuff.
Right. Let's talk about the person.
Apparently laws are only supposed to protect angels.
Right. To sort of set up this situation where it was justified.
Yeah.
On the flip side, there's been a tendency for some activists, not all, to really repress that dimension and focus instead on the fact that this person was a family man and had so many children and was a person who attended church services or whatever they decide to focus on. In a way, both things are true, right? That the people, someone can have a violent past, have a criminal past, and then also at the same time be a great person. What we should be doing is focusing in on what's happening to these people, right? Who are they? What do they have in common? Even when we get beyond the urban theater and begin to talk to folks in small towns, in suburban areas, in regions of the country where there aren't very many Black people, which sometimes have the highest per capita rates of police killings. When we look at it that way, we're looking at primarily the most vulnerable elements of the working class, right? Even the high profile victims of police violence who are Black. Look at their actual experiences, right? I mean, some of these people are folks who, at the point of their arrest that leads to their killing, they're doing something that amounts to survival crimes, or they're living in places where survival crimes, criminalized forms of work are being heavily policed, right? So like George Floyd would be a good example. I mean, he's somebody who moved to Minneapolis as part of a program to support men who had been battling with addiction and are trying to change their lives, right? So he moves there as part of some church ministry. He gets a job as a bouncer. He works a few other jobs. And at the time of his encounter with Derek Chauvin, like so many Americans, he's unemployed, right? Because of the pandemic. And he's also, I think he's also been diagnosed with COVID, right? So he's in that moment just trying to simply have a moment of reprieve from all of the things that are happening to him. And he ends up being killed by this cop, right? But I just think that a lot of those cases are very similar to his, right? These aren't just Black people who are professional managerial class or bankers who are being stopped by cops. That rarely happens. And when it does, that person typically has much more in the way of resources and power and class position to mitigate that experience with police. So I think there's a very different situation, and we're blinded to it because of the Black Lives Matter banner, which is powerful, but powerful things can sometimes not always be good things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about like the Obama's remember Obama's beer summit, the guy
with Henry Louis Gates.
yeah.
People always bring that up too. Whenever I make the class argument, that's the first thing. Oh, wait, what about Henry Louis Gates?
Which, well, okay, but like, it's also like, well, what about that, right? I mean, like, there's something about the way that that's sort of picked up as symbolism that's like really telling too, because it's like, okay, part of like what made this like a striking story is that it was very unusual, like that it's not that for an Ivy League professor to be hassled, by the cops is something that almost never happens, regardless of their race. It's also, and it's but it's like the way that was sort of taken as, I mean, the fact that they did the beer summit, right? The way that that was like sort of taken as this, like treated as if it was this representative instance, I think is maybe kind of revealing of some of what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. I mean, people always bring it up. They bring up Henry Louis Gates. And my easy response is just, okay, yeah, he got into an argument with a cop.
Yeah.
And he ended up having a beer with the president. That's not George Floyd, right? Yeah. That's not, Freddie Gray.
Yeah, if George Floyd had survived his encounter with Derek Chauvin, he would, even if Hillary had won the election instead of Trump, he would not. George Floyd would not have gotten an invite to the White House out of that.
Doubt it. Yeah, seriously doubt it. So yeah, I just think like it's an evasion, right? There are many of those things that people resort to whenever they're pressed on the class character of policing, and I think that's a big problem for the left, right? Why can't we talk about Black people as a people with classes? Why can't we talk about the specific predicament of working class Blacks, and especially people who are unemployed, with some precision and clarity and focus on the empirics of it all, as opposed to resorting to these broad, abstractions about race?
Yeah, I mean, I actually remember in the summer of 2020 seeing a prominent left-wing YouTuber who will remain anonymous for the purposes of this example.
Probably guess who it is.
But this guy had said that the it's whatever, it's a tweet, it's not an essay, but like I remember it always stuck in my head. He said this thing about Black people and workers having interests in common. So it's like, okay, wait a second. Black people aren't divided into social classes. Like this is just this like monolithic category off to the side. That's different. Like white people, they're workers and bosses and landlords and tenants and all that stuff, right? But Black people are all just like one big thing. That's and one big thing where everybody in the thing is in equal danger of police violence, which is, I mean, obviously it's one of the big themes of the book, and what you've been talking about is just empirically not true. That there are neighborhoods that are subjected to this kind of policing, and there are neighborhoods that are not.
Right.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.